Good morning. Can you guys, Davey, I'm all set. So in the spirit of this workshop, I'm going to do all my comments, partly in response to Ben, but I do want to lay out various things. So it's a hard act to follow Ben, something well above my pay grade, but let's see what will happen. I'm going to take the context that Ben laid out as given. I just do want to make one note about electricity markets internationally in developing or emerging economies. I've done some work in Africa and what colonials call East Asia in terms of this, and where markets, they're starting from scratch. In other words, they didn't have or don't have a reliable and fully developed power system and grid and regulatory structure or even a governance. I was asked once, how do you develop power markets if the country's at war? Well, not to be flippant, you gotta stop the war. And this, I think, will bring up to where I'm going to try to add to today's discussion about institutional issues, which Ben, I think, alluded to, but I want to kind of broaden that discussion. So power markets have an opportunity, I think, by attracting capital, if you can get that balance right between, for example, market power and investment incentives in areas that are outside of the context that we're probably going to be speaking about today, which is a place like the US, where we have a long-standing history, in other countries as well. We have the regulatory structure, we have governance in place, both at the state and federal level, but also of the RTOs themselves. So my emphasis will be, in my remarks or my reactions, is that I think the issue isn't about solving problems. Solving problems is great fun, so MIPS or formulating optimization problems. But I think the real issue is turning messes into problems. So I think there's a set of issues, messes that aren't well-formed, well thought out, well-defined problems that are kind of the antecedent to much of what Ben discussed. Now, that makes it harder. It also makes it easier because you can just say, well, that's a political problem, and then you go away and you solve another problem. But in terms of trying to advance what I think where we are, I think it's these messes that bring in institutional issues, kind of more of the social sciences, but again in a rigorous way. So that's kind of one comment which I'll try to develop. And I think that stems from, and that's reflected in a variety of things, that first of all, electricity is not really viewed as a commodity, it's viewed as a merit good. It's almost viewed as a right. And you can almost hear it, you do hear it in the various political language coming from various parts, sectors, where you think about electricity as a right. I mean, it's not in the Bill of Rights, that was the dawn, before electricity, but nonetheless, it's almost a right. It's something that we think about it in more egalitarian terms as opposed to a commodity where prices and markets determine all. So with that in mind, I'd like to make kind of 6 points and then react to Ben's comments. Hopefully I won't go over my time. One is this issue of market complexity versus simplicity. And I think that is important. So the thought I always had when I hear this is what was said Mozart said in the movie Amadeus, or at least allegedly said, which is someone said, your music's too complicated, too many notes. He says, not too many, not too few, just the right amount. And of course that brings up the debate that was happening with Scott and between two of my advisors, between the Pool-Comb models, remember that debate, and the more decentralized, and then that was manifested in flow-gate models as well. But to what extent can we centralize or decentralize the market? So that debate has happened. It's further magnified by what I think are the probably as critical or more critical institutional issue, which is the state-federal jurisdictional issue, which is not unique to the US, although we have it in grandeur. And where states like, for example, New Jersey, think PJM, I'm going to oversimplify, is the root of all evil because it is it's allow that dirty coal plants from Ohio that we have to pay for. Our money leaves the state, and in New Jersey, like every state, the world starts and ends at the state boundary, even though that was developed before the dawn, before the age of electricity. So we're paying money that leaves the state to import dirty air. Needless to say, they view the role and the goals of power systems and markets very differently from someone who's trying to optimize, who says, I'm optimizing. You see, I'm optimizing over this this great region. They don't view it as, or you could see in other states as well, and it was manifested in these capacity debates on minimum offer prices, right? So we started worrying about electricity markets, market power, supplier market power was the major concern, and yet through the back door, a combination of political, where we have monopsony issues, where the state perhaps intervenes in one framing to push prices down. Of course, the state would argue is, no, I'm correcting the market failure of importing dirty air from the West. The other element here is a lot of focus, so you get these optimization models, you get the right market, presumably you've minimized cost or maximized social welfare, but there are huge amounts of non-market price recovery mechanisms. So states are just replete with these. So for example, renewable portfolio standards. So, you know, and this is, I think, ties to the thrust of this workshop, which is from a manufacturing or from a user's point of view, how do I learn more, what are the research topics to react to market signals? Well, if only a portion of your electric bill is reflected in the wholesale piece, and there are other even generator charges that are coming through the retail rate, through societal benefits charge, through an RPS renewable portfolio standard, that's a very different world. So I think it's an interesting research question about multiple prices, right? We see or signals, some are from the state, some are from the wholesale market. How do they align, and how do those two prices interact, or those two, quote, markets interact? And do we get the right price signal, and then how, as a consumer, or perhaps a large consumer, respond to that in a rational way when their policies are changing and are set at different levels of government? Fourthly, to further endear me to the RTOs and ISOs, I think we need to look at those organizations not as algorithm implementers. In other words, Ben and Uday will give our, or the RTOs a new algorithm, a mixed integer linear program, and say it's a lot better than Lagrangian relaxation. And they'll take that and they implement that algorithm, and that's what they do. They're just like the Sergeant Friday, just the facts. Well, there are institutions, and like every institution, including all the ones I've worked for, they tend to think about their survivability. The senior management tends to think, middle management, junior management, tend to think about their role as an institution going forward. I know Scott and Tabors made these arguments with the formation of RTOs. And then that affects the calculus. So the economists would call that a principal agent problem or a political economy problem. So if you hand an institution a better tool, it may not necessarily result in the types of outcomes that you want. Institutions think about survivability and what are the implications for that. And there's a huge asymmetric information between what we know, and this was Bennett was alluding to this, I believe, with the complexity. Markets are so complex, how do we know the prices are calculated right? The New York ISO, I think, took 6 years to issue a final invoice, where they got the prices right, 6 years. Partly they were in the old world. In the utility world, it doesn't really matter when you do the accounting. You just put in a deferred account and you work through the tort process, right? The kabuki dance of rate setting and rate making and all that. And you just have an account and it gets interest and then you resolve the problem. Whereas in the commodity world, you've got to close the books daily, let alone, annually, let alone daily. So again, institutional issues and just how institutionals think about that. So I think we really need to think about, and I think this is further important, is if you believe, which I don't really do, but if you believe that the future world is a lot more distributed, in fact that the grid kind of melts away or maybe it just fades into the background and we have distributed resources however we get there, storage, solar, smart grid, some combination, but you can imagine a story. We can assign probabilities and argue about that. So are the RTOs are they just going to sit around and say, okay, work's done, I'm done, go ahead and go to a decentralized approach? Should we turn them into the distribution version of RTOs? DSOs, distributed system operators. Is that a separate entity? And again, we're back to the state federal issues in the US. But even if you don't think the world goes that way, even if we're under fundamentally a centralized grid, the RTOs have a governance process where stakeholders get to vote, and there's issues about 205, 206 federal rights. But putting aside those issues, the RTOs now, PJM is like 700 stakeholders, 800 stakeholders, 900. What do you do if they're 10,000? what do you do? At some point, you just can't have a big enough conference room or telephone call. And does it really make sense to have 10,000 stakeholders? What does governance look like? At some point, perhaps the camel's back will break on that. So again, there are institutional issues with that. I think another big area, which I know Mort and others have worked on, is climate change and the grid. That's more long-term, and how do you integrate, because of the intermittency issues, long-term capacity models with trying to capture the short-term operational issues. Can you just separate the problems? Can you just, say, well, we'll solve the operational problems in 2040. When we get there, we'll just do the long-term expansion, or are those models need to be together? So now I can say MPEC, which is, I'm going to say Lagrangian relaxation, mixed integer linear program, and MPEC, and then I'll be part of the in crowd. I don't know what they mean, but I can say them. Role of models. Okay, so Ben was talking about, how do you communicate models, complexity versus simplicity, but also intuition versus prediction. And these models inform the public policy process. So sometimes the wrong model, but with the right communication strategy, can be good in a sense. So how do we communicate beyond immediate techies and stakeholders into a larger context? With that, how much time do I have, like 5 minutes? Or? Okay, so I will, I just want to pick up on certain comments that Ben made. Again, the presentation is obviously in the context of a single objective. Perhaps this is a multi-objective problem. I mean, an objective where you can't reduce to the same dollar amount. Perhaps it's really a political negotiation, and models can be used, not operational models, but the modeling about should we do this or that long term in terms of policies. Maybe they're just as part of the political and policy negotiation that we need to think about. And then again here, the state-federal issues. The way I interpret just and reasonable rates, and that is economic efficiency. So I think you can put that interpretation there, but it really doesn't meet the needs of the broader use of the electricity system, grid, to advance environmental equity issues, political issues, and so forth. So there's a whole range of things. And the question there is, I think, can we solve the problem by making the problem bigger, right? Can we, by bringing in these institutional, or do we just get lost in the woods because there's just no way to model the strategic behavior of PJM versus NYISO versus the state of New Jersey, and we're just back to, raw politics, for example. I agree with the points Ben made about, one hand clapping, half a market. The demand side is not really involved. And the analysis that Ben did, I had this debate with Craig Glazer at PJM of all places, Senegal at dinner, where we were doing a workshop for the US government on bringing power markets to Western Africa. We also did elsewhere about the the double payment. And I think it just doesn't work, and this whole issue of price suppression. But we have to understand the politicians are trying to thread the needle between making the environment better, addressing greenhouse gases, and lowering prices. The temptation to bring those two things, which are irreconcilable, together is just very strong politically. So this whole notion about, be careful when someone offers you something for free. I think it was Margaret Thatcher said, when you run out of other people's money, see how costly things are. I think Harvard Electricity Policy Group did a session on the high cost of low cost electricity, which captures this tension that I've been trying to allude to. In terms of grid modeling, better models are great, they're very important, but if you're running faster down the wrong road, you just get to the wrong place sooner. So we have to, I think, maybe step back or put this in a broader institutional. I don't know how to do that besides just raising these issues. And then finally, in terms of market designs, at some point, not only do we have to decide or determine or ask, should we have a more decentralized world? Again, I don't really come to that position, but it's a reasonable question. When, how, if, when, and how, but also how do we transition, right? So even if we see the future, how do we get from a certain, QWERTY keyboard to another keyboard if in 30 years or 20 years or 5 years, depending on who you talk to, or never, to a much more distributed resource, microgrid, that type of world that's where the central grid doesn't dominate. So with that, I think I'll stop.